Reflecting on the fact the last time I was in Ayr was, I think, 27 years ago, something like that, which makes me feel very, very old. And it's probably changed in that time. Of course, it's pitch black out there and I can't see it. But it's great to be in this part of Scotland. I now live in Dundee. And one of the things about Dundee is everyone I know in Dundee thinks that Dundee is in fact the centre of Scotland and in fact the universe. So I always like to come back from other parts of this great nation and say, no, 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 there is life to the west, Glasgow. But wonderful to be with you this evening, and really good to be looking at this really important topic. So as Rory said in his introduction, I hope to share with you for about half an hour or so some thoughts on this, and hopefully plant lots of questions in your mind, and then when it comes to the time of Q&A, you can ask all of your great questions, and I will answer the easy ones. And Rory has said he's happy, really happy, to answer the harder ones. The South Africans like a challenge. Just look at the way they play rugby, and so we'd love to put into that. And just to mention, my book, thank you for mentioning it. So the Atheists Didn't Exist. If, again, some of what I said this evening intrigues you, I can only pack so much into half an hour. So do grab a copy. And this is really, like Rory said, trying to become a humorous introduction to some of the issues that we're talking about tonight, as well as a few others. Because one of the things I want to encourage people right at the start is no matter what you believe this evening, many of you here may have a religious faith, may call yourselves Christians. There may be folks here this evening who would prefer other labels, atheist, skeptic, freethinker, or there may be people this evening who are sitting here thinking, I don't really know what I believe, and I've come along this evening just to think about some of these things. Hopefully there's something in my talk for you, and more in the book if you want to follow up. So the reason I think this evening's topic is a great one, and when Rory sort of said, I'd love you not just to come but to talk on this topic, is you only have to open the newspaper, right, to see that the problem of evil and suffering is kind of all around us. We live in a world with daily examples of suffering. If it's not Syria, or Aleppo, or the sort of shooting in the USA, or something that Donald Trump has tweeted through in the morning, or the kind of political mess that we're experiencing here in the UK, or the sex scandal currently tearing politics apart, it seems there are examples of suffering, evil, crime, violence, and injustice wherever you look. And this raises all kinds of questions, actually, not just religious questions that we're going to look at this evening. It raises some interesting political questions. You know, how do we solve the problem of humanity? If you were somebody who was inclined to believe that human beings are basically getting better and better and better, then again, you just have to open a newspaper to see this is not the case. And, of course, at the same time, it raises the question, if there is a God, if there is a God out there, especially a God like the God that Christians claim to believe in, a God who is all-powerful, a God who is loving, then why is there evil and suffering in the world? Does the existence of evil and suffering sort of blow the idea that there is a God, or is there some kind of way that we can reconcile some of these things? So this evening I really want to introduce three thoughts to you this evening over the next half an hour or so. I want to talk a little bit about what I call the reality of evil. I want to talk a little bit about the nature of evil. And I want to talk a little bit about the universality of evil before I then will sort of share a little bit about what, as a Christian, I've sort of thought around some of these things and what I believe Jesus and the Christian faith uniquely have to say around some of these subjects. So let's talk about the reality of evil for a moment. One of the things that intrigues me is when you're faced with a world with the problems that we see all around us, the one option not open to you is to deny that evil exists. I don't really think that's an option. And that may sound odd to you. You may be thinking this evening, that's an obvious thing to say. Why would you begin by saying that, Andy? Well, the reason is there are some worldviews and some belief systems that try to do that. So a classic example would be Buddhism, for example. Those Eastern religions. And the approach that Buddhism generally takes is to deny that suffering exists. Suffering is an illusion. Suffering is actually really caused by attachment. And if you could just detach yourself from the world and float entirely free from this world that we see around us, this world of pain and tears, then you will see that suffering is an illusion. And that's really the kind of Buddhist attempt in a nutshell to deal with the problem of suffering. And the problem is it simply doesn't work in the real world. What does it look like to say to a victim of violence or crime or injustice, hey, if you could just understand how the world really is, you would realise that there has been no injustice, there is no evil, you weren't really a victim of crime. What does that really mean to say that to somebody who's had their home burgled, a loved one killed in a murder, or perhaps has experienced a sexual assault or abuse? I don't think that really works in the real world. And as some thinkers have pointed out, it's probably not an accident that Buddhism has never generated, for example, human rights movements, has grown out of that religion. It simply hasn't got the resources to do so. Now, okay, this is Eastern religion. But then there's also a worldview and a belief system much closer to home, here in the West, that also denies that evil exists. And that's atheism. Now, that may shock you to hear me say that, but if you are a committed atheist, you really are committed to the worldview that everything we see around us is atoms and particles in motion. I have many atheist friends who tell me very stridently that they believe that physics and chemistry and biology explain everything. Everything we see, from the motions of atoms to the orbits of planets to the behaviour of human beings. And the problem is, while it may sound very clever to say that, you then have a problem, of course, when you come up against things like evil and injustice. But how can you label one action evil or another action good if everything is the same sort, atoms moving around? And as somebody wants to remark, science can tell you how the world is, but science can't tell you how the world should be. And actually, if you are a really committed atheist, the problem of evil is a very thorny problem to deal with. In fact, just how thorny a problem is illustrated by the life of this gentleman on the screen behind me. This is a man whose name was W.H. Auden. For any sort of students of literature in the room this evening, very famous poet, in fact, lived for a while here in Scotland. And Auden's story is an interesting one. He grew up in the Anglican Church, in the Church of England, and as a young man abandoned his faith. He kind of threw off the shackles of religion. He became effectively a humanist. He believed that humanity was getting better and better and better. We didn't need God, that science could explain everything, and so on and so on. Well, he eventually moves to America and ends up in New York, living in Manhattan. And in 1939, living in Manhattan, he goes one day to a cinema to watch a movie, a German-speaking part of the town. And just before the movie came on, they played a newsreel. This is the days before sort of BBC News at 10, certainly before, Twitter and Wikipedia, some total avoiding us on the internet, all those kind of technologies. And the way you got your news in those days is either newspapers or you go to the cinema and you watch the newsreel that played for the movie. And this newsreel played that evening showed German troops marching into Poland at the start of what would become World War II. And Adam was shocked to see and hear Germans in the audience around him began to cheer and clap at what they saw on the screen. And the screen showed Polish being bayoneted or cut down the street by gunfire. People in the cinema would clap around him, people were cheering, kill, kill, kill the Poles. And Alan describes in his journal how he kind of rushed out of the cinema, his head spinning in an absolute whirl of confusion. Because he said, I realised in one moment that my humanist worldview had evaporated in front of me, because I had been confronted on the screen by real evil. He said, I realised instantly that Hitler was wrong, not just wrong because I didn't approve of him, he was actually evil. But then I realised that nothing in my humanism, nothing in my atheism allowed me to actually call evil evil. And he said almost in one moment in that cinema experience, his humanism evaporated. And actually in a few weeks' time, he had re-embraced with a vigour the Christian faith that he abandoned as a young man, because he figured out that it gave him the only framework to understand evil and actually diagnose the problem. And we're going to talk more about that a little later in this evening's talk. So that evil exists, I think, is undeniable, but I think even that recognition, if you are someone here this evening who doesn't have religious faith, is something worth reflecting on. Why is evil evil? Which in fact leads to my next question. What is evil? It's easy to throw the term around and say something is evil. We can hashtag it appropriately on Instagram or Snapchat or whatever, and go, that's evil, that thing that I've seen or experienced or read about. But actually, what is evil? What do we mean when we talk about evil? Well, clearly, evil has to be more than just my personal preference. Evil has to be more than simply something I don't like. For example, there are many, many things that I don't like. Here would be a good example, Marmite, for example. I know some people think it is in fact a health food, but actually I lived for 6 years in Canada, and a little secret for you, we have a big oil industry in Canada like we do here in Scotland, and Marmite is basically the residue at the bottom of the wells when the petroleum is coming. They didn't tell you that because the sales will plummet. Now, seriously, just because I don't like Marmite doesn't enable me to label that particular spreadable, comestible evil. I don't think so. I think all I can conclude is I don't like it. Well, here we have a problem. Does the same thing apply to things like violence, murder, and rape, and slavery, and other things? If I say they're evil, am I simply saying I don't like them? I don't think so. I think we want to be further than that in our language, so it has to be more than just my personal preference. Or maybe evil is societal preference. Maybe when we say something is evil, what we're saying is all of us approve of this. Well, here we have another problem. Consider the example of slavery. Every nation that we know of, historically, throughout the whole of time, has practiced slavery at some point in history. The Europeans had a slave trade. The Romans had a slave trade. The Persians had a slave trade. The Arabs had a slave trade. The indigenous North Americans had a slave trade. On and on it goes. Every nation, at some point in history, practiced slavery. Does that mean it was okay back then, and it's only today that we who are progressive have changed our view and so it's become evil? I don't think so. I think probably every one of us in this room this evening would want to say slavery has always been evil. It is always wrong, even if everybody around you thinks that it's okay. And so therefore we're recognising that whatever evil is, it is something bigger than just the preferences, either my individual preferences or the preferences of society. There's a very famous atheist philosopher, dead now, a famous atheist philosopher in the 1970s. His name was Arthur Leff. And Arthur taught at Yale University. He was one of the most eminent philosophers of his generation, hardline atheist. But he wrote what has come to be regarded as one of the most amazing essays, the most insightful essays on this subject of what is evil. If you're interested in finding it, incidentally, after the talk this evening, out your smartphone, just type Leff, L-E-F-F, and then Yale into Google, and it will come up as the #1 hit. It's been quoted so many times. And in that essay, Arthur says, well, here's the problem. When we talk about good and what we're talking about is oughts. You're saying something ought to be allowed or something ought not to be allowed. But here's the problem. In the absence of God, we hit the question of who decides. Who gets to decide what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's evil, what ought to be allowed, what ought not to be allowed. And he said, of course, we don't believe in God. He said, we're atheists in his case. He said, well, you've only got two options. Either you allow every individual to make up good and evil for themselves. And now you have 7 billion little godlets running around arguing with each other. And who arbitrates, as he puts it, between godlet claims? I say one thing is right, Roy says it's okay. How do we decide? We fight about it? We hold a cricket match where how do we decide? Or, said Arthur, you allow society to decide for you. You allow the state to decide for you. But most of us are probably quite uncomfortable about the idea of government stepping in and legislating and saying, this is right, this is wrong, everyone toe the line. We tend to be quite suspicious about that idea. But whichever route you take, whether you allow everyone to become little gods of their own making, or whether you say everyone just kowtows to the state, Arthur left said the same problem. So either authority claim, you can look at the person who's telling you to do something and say, yeah, says who? Says who? Who says it's wrong to do that? Who says? It's the cry of the playground bully. Says who? Who says that's wrong? And at the end of that essay that I just recommended you take a read sometime, he ends that essay, actually, with a little poem. A little piece of prose that he writes, actually, rather than a sort of philosophical paragraph to end with. He ends this sort of study of how we solve the problem of good and evil, which he broadly concludes we can't, with these words. He says, nevertheless, napalming babies is bad. Starving the poor is wicked, buying and selling each other is depraved. Those who stood up to and died resisting Hitler, Stalin, Armin and Pol Pot, General Custer too, they've earned salvation. Those who acquiesce deserve to be damned. There is in the world such a thing as evil, but all together now, says who? God help us. Amazing statement for an incredibly committed atheist to end with, God help us. Because basically he concludes, we simply, if you remove God from the horizon and throw God out, we have no way of even talking about good and evil, let alone solving that problem. And basically what Arthur is coming up against there in that essay is talk of evil implies an ought. When you say something is evil, what you were saying is people ought not to do that thing. If you're saying something is good, you're saying people ought to do this thing. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, where does that ought come from? And again, to return to my science example, we could conduct a scientific experiment that would tell us what would happen if I poisoned the coffee supply at local Rancho McDonald's just up the road. That would be an interesting scientific experiment. Don't anyone stop there this evening on the way here. We'll find out in about 5 minutes when people start killing sideways. But there is no one person looking very nervous. But there is no conceivable scientific experiment we could conduct that would answer the question of, should I poison the coffee at the local McDonald's? That's an entirely different question, and one that has all kinds of implications. So how do we begin answering that kind of question? Well, right at the start of sort of pushing into this evening, I want to suggest to you something that will become quite important, particularly in the last sort of second half of this talk. And that's that I think the whole question of good and evil, right and wrong, is linked to a far bigger question, actually. It's linked to the question of purpose. It's linked to the question of purpose. Think about this, friends. Imagine that you came up to me after this evening's talk, and you buy 2, 3, 4 copies of my book, Subliminal Advertising, right there. And we get chatting, and during the conversation, I just happen to mention that I'm in quite a bad mood this evening, and you think to yourself, well, Andy, you look like a friendly kind of sort of chap, what's wrong? And I say, well, I recently bought this new Apple Watch thing from the Apple store the other day, and Apple ripped me off because it's a bad watch. They sold me a bad watch. And you look at me and you say, well, why is it a bad watch? I said, well, last night I was trying to put a set of shelves up for my wife, and I was hammering in nails with my new Apple Watch, and I broke it. It's a bad watch. What would you say? I said one of two things. One, you might say, would you like the number of a good psychologist here and there? We have a few of those, maybe a little therapy, might not go amiss. But secondly, I expect you might sort of gently and pastorally try to say to me, Andy, you've misunderstood the purpose of a watch. The purpose of a watch is to tell the time, and the purpose of an Apple Watch is to do about 1,000 other things at the same time, but the purpose is clearly not to hammer and nails. And we determine whether a watch is a good watch or a bad watch by how well it tells the time. It tells the time well, it's a good watch. It tells the time badly, it's a bad watch. But you see, it's purpose that enables us to determine whether it's good or it's bad. So if this is true of watches and all kinds of other things we might talk about, what about human beings? That raises the question, what is the purpose of you and I, human beings? Do we have no purpose? Is that purpose simply to reproduce and pass on our DNA to the next generation? Are we nothing more than genetic puppets dancing to our DNA? And other people, therefore, most descendants you can have, you've done all right? Or is there more to human life than that? And can you see how that question raises some pretty big religious questions straight away? In fact, it leads us quite quickly to the implication, if God exists, we can talk about good and evil. Because if God exists, presumably, God had a purpose in creating me and creating you and creating every one of us on this planet. On the other hand, if there is no God, we are just a result of time plus chance plus natural selection, then there is no purpose to our lives. We simply are. We are just random cosmic accidents, and therefore you cannot talk about good, you cannot talk about evil, you cannot talk about right or wrong, or any of these things. One more thing I want to talk about for a little bit before we bring this into land on what the Bible and what Jesus had to say about all some of this stuff. We talk about the universality of evil for a moment. So we talk about the reality of evil. We've explored the whole question of what evil is. But one of the things that intrigues me, maybe intrigues some of you as well this evening, is that evil is pretty universal. It seems to be everywhere. If it isn't Aleppo, it's the latest shooting in the USA. If it's not sexual violence here in the UK, then it's goodness knows what kicking off in other parts of the European landmass, and so on and so forth. Wherever you look, open the newspapers, you tend to see evil everywhere. It seems to be pretty universal. And we are getting better as well. You could read writers a generation or so ago who thought technology would make the world a more peaceful place. In fact, it's very, very interesting that one of my areas of expertise, apart from Islamic studies, is computer science. And back in 1989, a gentleman called Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web. It's Tim you have to thank for Instagram and Wikipedia and endless cat photographs. And it's interesting to read quotes from people like Tim, who invented the founders of the internet, 20-odd years ago, saying things like, the universal access to the internet will bring peace and harmony. When we can connect people digitally, then get along better, and so on and so forth. Lots of people were smiling, ironically, at that one. Actually, what's interesting? We now have enough studies and enough data to show that the opposite is the case. That actually the internet has caused a rise in sort of hatred and sectarianism, all kinds of things. Anyone who's ever been trolled on social media can probably testify to that one. Technology doesn't seem to make us more humane. It only seems to give us new ways of being mean to each other. Problem is, evil is fairly universal. And don't just take my word as a Christian for that. Let me read you a little paragraph from John Gray. John is a very, very well-regarded atheist writer. He was for a long time at London School of Economics. He's now emeritus at one of the other London universities. And incredibly committed atheist, but also willing to recognise some problems with atheism. Let me read you what John says on this subject of evil. He writes, liberal humanism is a secular rendition of a Christian myth. But the truth of the myth has been lost on the way. The biblical story of the fall of Adam and Eve teaches that evil cannot be rooted out from human life. Humans are radically flawed, a perception rooted in the Christian doctrine of original sin. It is not error or ignorance that stands in the way of a better world. The human animal may yearn for peace and yearn for freedom, but is no less fond of war and tyranny. No scientific advance can answer the contradictions of human needs. On the contrary, they can only be intensified as science increases human power. Quite a wordy statement, but I hope you grasp the kind of gist of what he's saying, that the human animal, as John would put it, is a fairly messed up creature. And science has not made us better. If anything, it's actually made us worse. And what's interesting, he disagrees with many things that I would believe as a Christian, but he does go on to say the one thing that Christians got right was the idea that every human being is fundamentally broken. I remember reading that paragraph the first time on in John's books and went, that's amazing to hear an atheist say this. It's the kind of line you expect from a pastor, but here is John, who's a committed atheist. And what that means, if he's right, and I very much think he is, that means there's something quite uncomfortable about this whole discussion around evil and suffering, because it's easy to have it in the abstract. It's easy to talk about the evil out there. The problems in the world of the nasty people, the problems in the world of the bad people, the problems in the world of politicians and big business and people who are mean and Donald Trump and all of this, they're all the problem. I'm a nice, decent, basically good person. But what if that's not the case? What if each one of us in this room are as much of a problem as we are part of the solution? Nick Hornby, wrote the film About a Boy years ago, and many other books. Many of you may have come across him. Nick wrote this once in a column he wrote on this subject. And again, Nick is not a Christian, he's an agnostic of some kind. Nick Hornby writes, I'm a good person in most ways, but I'm beginning to think that being a good person in most ways doesn't count for anything very much if you're a bad person in one way. Very interesting observation. So if you and I are as much part of the problem as those who are responsible for Syria and other world evils we could talk about, how do we solve the problem of evil, and how does God fit into this? Well, that's what I'd like to talk about in my kind of final 10 minutes or so. And begin by talking a little bit about what the Bible has to say about the subject of evil. Because having read widely on the subject of evil and suffering over the years, one of the things that impresses me about the Bible, unlike any other book that I've actually read that talks about this subject, is the honesty of the Bible. It's the first place to begin. You see, the Bible is very clear that evil is real and that the world is not the way it should be. The Bible at the beginning of the very first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, tells the story of how God made a world that was good, beautiful, perfectly designed for us as human creatures to flourish and enjoy, but something went wrong at the beginning, and therefore the world is not the way that it should be. And that observation is amazingly helpful right away, because I think that's the instinctive reaction that every human being has when it comes to evil and suffering. I have never met a single atheist who looks at some example of suffering or injustice or violence on television news and goes, oh, well, that's okay, that's just atoms behaving the way that atoms do. Every human being looks at some of the atrocities we see from some of the war-torn parts of the world, and what's our instinctive reaction? No, that's not right, that shouldn't be allowed, that's not fair, something has to be done. The moment that you have that reaction, you would not call yourself a Christian in this room this evening. Interesting that that instinctive gut reaction actually aligns you closer with the biblical story than you might otherwise imagine. Because the Bible says absolutely, this is not the way the world was intended. The world was not supposed to contain evil and suffering and injustice, and we know it instinctively as human beings. So what went wrong? Why is there evil and suffering in the world? Well, that's a subject that we could take the whole evening on. But in a nutshell, a big part of the biblical story runs like this, that when God created this beautiful world into which he placed us, he designed us for a relationship. He designed us for a relationship with him. He designed us for a relationship with each other. Love is the supreme ethic, as it were, that God has placed into creation. But love requires something. One of the things love requires freedom. You can't coerce somebody to love you. Interesting thought experiment. What would happen if you were, in the next day or two, you were perhaps rooting around on the internet and you discovered a bit of a conspiracy? You discovered that everybody in your life who you think loves you, your friends, your spouse, other people in your life who you think care about you, the only reason that they care about you is because your mum and dad are bribing them to behave that way. That actually your parents, and if their parents are no longer still alive, don't worry, they left a legacy. So that these people in your life are paid on a regular basis to say nice things about you. That's the only reason your spouse is married to you, because they receive a bit of money into a Swiss bank account every month just to stay married to you. How would you feel? There's a few people looking at each other going, that explains so much. I suspected for a while. The answer is, I think it would change everything, right? Because love cannot be coerced, love cannot be bought, love has to be freely given for it to be love. And that's just the same in the case of God and his love. God gave us this incredible gift of freedom and built that into creation such that we might freely choose to love him, freely choose to love one another. But of course, with that gift of freedom comes the ability for us to misuse those gifts that God has given us. And much suffering, much evil in the world flows from human beings misusing this incredible gift of freedom and moral responsibility and accountability that God has given us. But if that's the case, that raises a question. If you're thinking this evening and tracking with me, you might be sitting there thinking, well, that's great. God gave us this gift of freedom so that we could love each other. That's wonderful. My word, what a gift. What an incredible gift. It's like, I once got a fairly strange, peculiar knitted jumper from a granny for Christmas. That was a strange gift. Thank you very much for freedom. I mean, God, would it not have been better for you not to give us that gift? Would it not have been better for you to create us as automata, as robots, so that the kind of world that we see doesn't exist? Aren't there some responsibilities that comes with what God has done? And now this is where things get very interesting. Because as it talks about this world that God has made, as it talks about what's gone wrong with the world, and as it talks about God's response to what's gone wrong with the world, what the Bible does not do is give us a detached philosophy. The Bible doesn't sit there and philosophize about the problem of evil, and I find that very helpful. Because when most of us are confronted with evil, or injustice, or suffering, or wrongdoing, we don't want a detached theory. What most of us want is something done about the problem of evil. Evil and suffering demands not words said, but something done. And the Bible, right at the heart of the biblical story, tells the story of what God has done about evil and suffering. So what is that? Well, in conclusion, a couple of things. What does evil and suffering demand? And let's see how this plays into what God has done here. I think the first thing that we need in the face of evil and suffering is we need compassion. Compassion is required in the face of evil and suffering. When you see someone who's experienced evil or injustice or suffering, I believe the response that it demands from us is compassion. Now, what is compassion? It's a word we use a lot, actually. We admire it, we talk about it, we like to think we are compassionate, we admire, respect those who are. What does compassion mean? Well, built into compassion is the idea of action. I wonder if you ever noticed this. In fact, the word compassion comes from two Latin words. Com, that means with, and passion, that means to suffer. And the word compassion literally means to suffer alongside. So, for example, if you're walking down the high street in Ayr in a few days' time, and you see perhaps a homeless person sleeping in a shop doorway, and you turn to the crowds around you in the street and you say, hey, homelessness is wrong. And then you walk on by and you do nothing. Maybe you tweet about it later. You've certainly engaged in a political advocacy. You've certainly been a moralizer. You've told everyone your opinions. Have you been compassionate? No. You've been absolutely no use to that person who was homeless and cold and hungry that night. Or if you're a student perhaps, or think back to your student days, imagine walking across campus and you see one student being racially abused by 4 bullies, and you look to the crowds of other students around you and you shout, hey, racism is wrong. Maybe you even take 30 seconds to make a little placard and put it on a stick as you walk by. Racism is wrong. And you walk on by, but you do nothing. Have you been compassionate? No. You have been a moralizer, but you have not been compassionate. Compassion requires action. On the other hand, if you see the homeless person at the shop doorway and you stop, you rearrange your entire, you tear up your plans for that evening, you were going out to perhaps dinner with a friend or a spouse or something, but you cancel those, you take that person, you find them a meal, you find them a bed for the night, maybe you even invite them home to spend the night at your home, even though you're running a risk, you know nothing about their background, but you decide that something has to be done. Now you're being compassionate, but have you noticed it has cost you something? Or you see that one student being racially abused by 4 other bullies, and you walk across, you run across the campus, you wade in, you separate the bullies off from them, you take the blows, you defend the person who's being racially abused. Now you have been compassionate, because you haven't just said something, you have done something, and it's cost you something. You've got 7 kinds of hell kicked out of you, but you have taken the blows, you have suffered alongside, you have been compassionate. One of the thinkers who has written the most on this is a Eastern European theologian called Miroslav Volf. And he says something very interesting here. It's not merely does evil require compassion, he says evil also requires justice. When we see evil happening, we see evil and suffering and violence and so forth, not merely we need compassion for the victims, but we need justice. And this just as much applies to God as it applies to human actions. I'm going to read you what he says here. This is quite a long quotation, but I really hope you'll track with this and get the gist of what he's saying, because I think it offers us a very interesting insight into this whole question of God and suffering and evil that we're exploring tonight. Miroslav Volf, who grew up in the Balkans, has seen his people abused, has seen ethnic cleansing on a scale most of us only possibly can never even conceivably imagine, wrote these words in one of his books. He said, my thesis is that the practice of non-violence requires a belief in divine vengeance. So the person who is inclined to dismiss this, I suggest imagining that you're delivering a lecture in a war zone. Among your listeners are people whose cities and villages have been first plundered, and then burned and levelled to the ground, whose daughters and sisters have been raped, whose fathers and brothers have had their throats slit. Soon you would discover that it takes the quiet of a suburban home for the birth of the thesis that human non-violence corresponds to God's refusal to judge. In a sun-scorched land, soaked in the blood of the innocent, that idea will invariably die. And as one watches it die, you will do well to reflect about many other pleasant captivities of the liberal mind. Long paragraph, but what he's getting at this is the whole problem of justice raises an interesting question. If you don't believe in God, and you experience horrific violence or injustice, as Miroslav's people in places like Croatia and the former Yugoslavia experienced, what are you going to do? Your village has been burned, your family members killed, perhaps female members of your family sexually abused, horrific violence and crime you've experienced. You do not believe in God. What do? Do you wait for the UN to come and sort it out? Well, good luck with that one. Notice, Miroslav, what you will do, invariably, is you'll take matters into your own hands. They killed my brother, I'll kill their brother. They burned my village, I'll burn their village. They raped my sister, and the list goes on and on and on. And he says, just look around the world, at the number of places in the world where the spiral of violence goes round and round and round. By contrast, he says, if you believe, really believe, not just sort of head knowledge or lip service to, but really believe in the fibre of your being, that there is a God who is just, and a God who will see all wrongs righted, then you can choose not to take revenge. You can leave justice to him rather than extend the spiral of violence. And so Miroslav says in that book, if we do not believe in God, we are in real trouble when it comes to some of these places in the world that we've already talked about this evening. So when it comes to evil, we need to think about compassion and where compassion comes from, and what it might look like to believe in a God who is truly compassionate. It's a whole question of justice, and will there be ultimate justice? If you believe that, then you don't have to extend the cycle of violence. If you don't believe that, there's a problem. But one last question that I think arises out of this whole question of suffering and injustice, and it leads right into the heart of the God question, and it concerns the whole question of forgiveness. Evil raises the whole question of forgiveness. You see, I had the privilege of travelling quite widely for my job and kind of speaking at universities and settings all over the world. And I've met all kinds of people with all kinds of backgrounds. And some of the saddest stories I've encountered is when I meet people who, because of something that was done to them at some point in the past, or perhaps some member of their family at some point in the past, they have not been able to find the power to forgive. And so they are now living bitter and twisted and enslaved almost by what happened in the past because they haven't found a way to let go. Forgiveness is hugely important, but where do you find the power? Especially when something really dreadful happens. November the 8th, 1987, there was a massive IRA bomb went off in a place called Inniskillen in Northern Ireland. It was the height of the Troubles. For those of you who are kind of my generation or older may remember that time. A massive bomb went off in a town called Inniskillen, and it was targeted by the IRA at the Remembrance Day parade. So it was targeted very much at civilians. And one man and his family were taking part in that parade. That man's name was Gordon Wilson. And Gordon was injured, and his daughter Marie was fatally injured. And after the bomb had gone off, Gordon and Marie were buried in rubble when that 40-pound bomb exploded. And unable to move, he lay next to her and held her hand as she lay dying. A few minutes later, rescuers pulled Wilson and his daughter out from the collapsed rubble of the building. She never regained consciousness. Shortly after, Gordon Wilson was interviewed by the BBC about that tragedy. I just want to read you a report actually from BBC News on the story of Gordon and his daughter. It says, during the interview, Gordon Wilson described with anguish the last conversation he had with his daughter and his feelings toward her killers. Gordon said, she held my hand tightly and gripped me as hard as she could. She said, "Daddy, I love you very much." Those were her exact words to me. And they were the last words I ever heard her say. To the astonishment of listeners, Gordon Wilson went on to add, "But I bear no ill will. I bear no grudge. Dirty sort of talk is not going to bring her back to life. She was a great wee lassie. She loved her profession. She was a pet. She's dead. She's in heaven, and we shall meet again. I will pray for the men who did this tonight and every night." And the article ends by saying, as the historian Jonathan Barden recounts, no words in more than 25 years of violence in Northern Ireland have had such a powerful emotional impact. And so the question that raises for me is, where does someone like Gordon Wilson find the power to publicly forgive those who planted that bomb? It would be incredibly easy for him to call down condemnation, to cry out for injustice, to rage and rant and so on and so forth. Where did he find the power to plead that nobody take revenge for his daughter's death, to pray for those who done this, and plead, as they would, Lord is on his own side, not to shed blood in response? How do you find the power to forgive? And the problem as we draw this to a final close, the problem we run into, that the story of Gordon Wilson illustrates, is that justice and forgiveness contradict. Justice and mercy contradict. Have you ever noticed this? Have you noticed that justice and mercy contradict? Let me give you an example to illustrate what I mean. Imagine that as you walk out of this university campus this evening, the local police swoop and arrest you. They discover that heinous crime that you committed on the weekend. You probably shouldn't have put it on your Facebook feed, but there we are. You worry that some people are looking nervous and nudging one another. And anyway, the police grab you, they hastily convene a criminal court tomorrow morning, you're brought before the court, you're tried before a jury of your peers, you're found guilty of this heinous crime that you committed on the weekend, and the judge peers down at you from the bench, and she says, "Well, I'm a judge who is renowned at being utterly fair and utterly just. According to the law of the land, for this crime that you have committed, you should be sentenced to prison for 20 years, so 20 years is what you're going to get. Bang, and away they lead you to cells." Has the judge been just? Yes, right? Yeah, you committed the crime, you do the time. She has followed the law to the letter. Has she been merciful? No, not an ounce of mercy. She's been just pure, cold, hard justice. Well, now let's replay the scene. You walk out in this evening, you're arrested by the police. They find out about that crime that you committed on the weekend. You shouldn't put it on Facebook. They hastily convene a court. You're tried by a jury of your peers tomorrow morning, found guilty. The judge peers down at you from her bench. She says, according to the law of the land, you should be sentenced to 20 years in prison. But you know what? Today is my birthday. I'm feeling happy and joyful and merciful, so you know what? You may go free. Leave my courtroom before you. I've changed my mind. You would run from her courtroom, I imagine, as fast as your little legs would carry you. Has she been merciful? Yes, incredibly merciful. You should have got 20 years in the slammer. You got none. She's been incredibly merciful. Has she been just? No, thank you. She's ignored the law. And in fact, I imagine certain newspapers, let's be honest, the Daily Mail, would be running the next day, not with wonderfully merciful judge, would be running with some headline about the travesty of the Scottish legal system, that some terrible criminal has got to stop free because it's the judge's 40th birthday. She's been merciful, but she hasn't been just. In the first scenario, she's been just, but she hasn't been merciful. You see, mercy is always executed. Mercy is always given at the expense of justice. You cannot hold two together. If you execute justice, you cannot be merciful. If you're going to be merciful, you can't execute justice. And if that certainly applies to human judges, my word must apply to God. And it raises the interesting question, if God were to treat us, were to treat the human race as the way we have behaved deserves, he would be just, but he would not be merciful. On the other hand, if God would really pat us on the head and go, well, you know what, you've done a fairly good job, but you know what, I'm just going to overlook the mess you've made of things, he would be a God who is merciful, but not a God who is just. How do those two things hold together? Well, in the Christian faith, those two things come together at the cross of Jesus Christ, where Jesus, God in the flesh, steps into the scene and says to the human race, individually, to you and to I know the mess that you've made of your life, and I know exactly what should happen if I execute justice as justice deserves. And the person of Jesus volunteers to step into the gap and pay the debt on our behalf so that we don't have to, and that therefore forgiveness and mercy can be extended to us by God. If one of you were to come up to me at the end of the talk this evening, ask to borrow my iPad, and I'll read the notes from here. Unlikely I would lend it to you. I need it to play Candy Crush Saga in the laboratories afterwards. That's productivity for you right there. Well, again, lots of nervous looks, people nudging each other, going, hey, you did that. Anyway, you come and ask to borrow my iPad. In a moment of foolishness, I lend you my iPad. 5 minutes later, you come back to me and you say, Andy, I'm really sorry, but I've broken your iPad. No more Candy Crush Saga for you. And I look at it and I say, my word, this is quite an expensive mistake you've made here. I mean, this is going to cost several £100 to fix this thing, because this is an Apple product, not one of those plastic Samsung Google things. It's funny, you can pick on those like tribal things, but I tell you, wade into the Apple Samsung thing, people are looking at you going, outside afterwards. Anyway, I say to you, it's going to cost £300 to repair this, and then you break down in tears, and you say, I'm just a poor, university student. I can't afford to pay for iPads. What am I going to do? And I look at you and I say, you know what? I'll cover it. Don't worry. I've got it covered. You're good. Now, if you were to trot out of here, go home and tell your friends, tomorrow at work on Facebook or wherever to go, guess what I learned on Tuesday night at university? I learned that you can break iPads and it's free. It's amazing. That would be the wrong message, and you and I might need to have a conversation. Because that freedom and that forgiveness wasn't free. I paid so that you didn't have to. And that's the message of the Christian faith when it comes to evil and suffering and injustice. Not just the evil and suffering and injustice out there, but the evil and suffering and injustice in here that we don't have to pay, because Jesus has done. So there can both be justice and there can be forgiveness. One of the most famous Christian speakers and writers, preachers who've ever lived, most people have heard of him, even if you're not Christian here this evening, gentleman on the right-hand side, Billy Graham. And Billy, now old man, still alive, still going strong, but frail, but preaching his career to millions upon millions of people around the world. Well, in his autobiography, Billy Graham tells of a meeting. In fact, it's portrayed there on the screen. The on the left is a man called Konrad Adenauer. And Konrad was, at the time of the meeting, he was the German Chancellor. And before that, he'd been mayor of Cologne in Germany, and he was actually imprisoned by Hitler during the Second World War because Konrad Adenauer was an opponent of the Nazis, and for resisting the Nazis, Hitler had him thrown into prison. But after the war, he became the German Chancellor, and it was his job to try and help rebuild the shattered country that the Nazis had left and began putting German society back together again. Well, when Adenauer and Billy Graham met, one of the first things that Konrad Adenauer asked Dr. Billy Graham, he said, Dr. Graham, do you believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead? Do you believe in the resurrection of Jesus? And Graham, rather surprised about this question from the political leader, looked at Konrad Adenauer and went, oh, yes, I do. I do. Konrad Adenauer, a man with all that responsibility and all that weight of justice and everything that happened on his shoulders, looked at Dr. Graham and said these words. He said, Dr. Graham, outside of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, I do not know of any other hope for our world. I entirely agree with him.